You know what finally embarrassed me into changing how I build? I was at an estate sale a few years back, and there was this cabinet in the garage. Beautiful red oak, nice proportions, clearly somebody's passion project. But every joint had opened up. The top had a crack running almost 14 inches. Pocket hole screws were backing out of the sides like they were trying to escape. That piece was maybe 8 years old. Then about 6 months later, I got to examine a Tansu chest that a collector friend of mine brought back from Kyoto. It was built in the 1880s, no screws, no nails, barely any glue, and every joint was still tight enough that you couldn't slide a piece of paper into it. That moment changed everything for me. Today I want to walk you through 10 things most of us do in the shop that would make a Japanese master craftsman shake his head, and what they do instead. Plus, stick around to the end, because I have a layout trick I learned from a Japanese timber framer that I guarantee you have never seen before. Let me get into it. What we are really talking about today is the difference between building furniture that lasts a decade and building furniture that lasts a century. Japanese woodworking traditions have been refined over more than 1,000 years, and the principles behind them are not mystical or out of reach. They are practical, logical, and once you understand them, you will never look at your own projects the same way. So let me give you a little context first. Japanese woodworking did not develop in a vacuum. Japan is a country with brutal humidity swings, earthquakes, and historically limited access to metal fasteners. Woodworkers there had to solve real engineering problems using nothing but wood, hand tools, and an incredibly deep understanding of how timber behaves. The tradition that impressed me most is what is sometimes called sashimono, which is the craft of furniture making using interlocking wood joints with no nails, no screws, and minimal adhesive. These craftsmen apprentice for years, sometimes a decade, before they are trusted to build on their own. And the philosophy underneath all of it comes down to one idea: respect the wood enough to understand how it wants to move, and then design your joints and your structure around that movement, instead of fighting it. When I first heard that framed that way, I thought it sounded nice but impractical. Then I started applying it, and I realized every piece of furniture I had ever built was essentially fighting the wood. I was forcing material into shapes and holding it there with glue and metal, and then acting surprised when it tore itself apart. That realization was humbling, but it was also the most useful lesson I have ever learned in the shop. All right, number 1, pocket holes as structural joinery. I will be the first to admit I owned a pocket hole jig for years and used it on everything: face frames, table aprons, you name it. But here is the problem. A pocket hole screw is driven at an angle into end grain, and end grain has almost no holding power. It works fine for face frames on a cabinet that sits against a wall, but the moment you use it as the primary connection in a table or a chair, something that gets racked and stressed every day, you're on borrowed time. A Japanese craftsman would use a mortise and tenon for that same connection, wood to wood, long grain to long grain, with mechanical interlock that actually gets tighter under load. The holding power is not even in the same universe. Number 2, drowning every joint in glue. I used to think if a little glue is good, a lot of glue is better. I would slather yellow glue on every surface like I was frosting a cake. But Japanese craftsmen use glue sparingly, if at all. And here is why. When you flood a joint with adhesive, the glue becomes the structure. And wood glue, even the best stuff, is rigid. It does not flex. So when the wood moves seasonally, and it will move, the glue either cracks or the wood splits around it. Japanese joinery is designed so that the wood itself is the structure. The joint holds mechanically. If they use any adhesive at all, it is usually a rice-based paste that remains slightly flexible. The lesson here is not to throw out your glue bottles. It is to stop asking glue to do the job that good joinery should be doing. By the way, if you are enjoying learning about these ancient methods, I put together something I think you will really appreciate. It is called Kenji's Workshop, and it is a collection of 100 ancient Eastern woodworking secrets for the modern craftsman. Techniques like the ones we are covering today, and a whole lot more. You can grab your copy by scanning the QR code on screen or just use the first link in the description. All right, let us keep going. Number 3, ignoring wood movement entirely. This is the big one. This is the mistake that kills more furniture than any other, and most hobbyist woodworkers do not fully understand it until something cracks. Wood moves. It expands across the grain when humidity rises and contracts when it drops. A 12-inch wide panel of red oak can move more than a quarter inch across its width over the course of a year. Japanese craftsmen plan for this in every single joint. They use floating panels in frames. They orient their grain so that movement is predictable and accommodated. They never glue a solid panel across its full width into a rigid frame. When I started actually measuring seasonal movement in my own shop, I realized I had been building time bombs. Every tabletop I had screwed down tight to a rigid apron was just waiting for winter to crack it in half. Number 4, sanding instead of planing. Most of us finish a surface by running through the sandpaper grits. 120, 150, 180, 220, done. A Japanese woodworker finishes a surface with a hand plane called a kana, and a properly tuned kana leaves a surface that is genuinely smoother than anything sandpaper can produce. Here is the science behind it. Sanding scratches and tears the wood fibers. It leaves thousands of tiny broken ends on the surface. A sharp plane severs the fibers cleanly, leaving them intact. The result is a surface that reflects light differently, absorbs finish more evenly, and feels like glass under your hand. When I first ran my fingers across a kana-finished board of hinoki cypress, I understood immediately why they consider sanding to be damage. Number 5. Building with big box lumber straight off the rack. I used to grab boards at the home center, check them for straightness by eyeballing down the edge, and start cutting. Japanese craftsmen would never do that. They select wood based on how it was grown, where in the log it came from, how it was dried, and how long it has been acclimating. They look at growth ring orientation and grain runout before they make a single cut. When I started buying rough lumber from a local mill and letting it acclimate in my shop for at least 2 weeks before milling it, the difference in my finished projects was dramatic. Less warping, less cracking, fewer surprises. Number 6, skipping the layout and relying on jigs. I love a good jig as much as anyone, but I noticed that Japanese craftsmen spend an extraordinary amount of time on layout before they ever pick up a cutting tool. They use a marking knife called a shirabiki and a bamboo marking gauge to scribe lines directly into the wood. Every cut has a precise knife wall to register against. When I started doing proper knife wall layout instead of just drawing pencil lines and trusting my jig to handle the accuracy, my joints started fitting on the first try. Jigs are useful, but they are not a substitute for knowing exactly where your cuts need to land. Number 7, using screws where joinery belongs. Screws are incredibly convenient, but a screw is a metal fastener in a wood hole, and those two materials do not expand and contract at the same rate. Over years, the screw hole elongates, the connection loosens, and you end up with wobbly furniture. Japanese joinery uses wood-to-wood connections that respond to humidity changes together because they are the same material. A well-cut mortise and tenon, a dovetail, even a simple dado will outlast a screw connection by decades. I still use screws for shop fixtures and jigs, but I stopped using them in anything I want to survive. Number 8, finishing with one coat and calling it done. I used to wipe on one coat of polyurethane and move on. Japanese finishing traditions take a completely different approach. Their lacquer work, called urushi, involves building up dozens of thin layers over weeks, sometimes months. Now, I am not suggesting anyone start harvesting lacquer from trees, but the principle matters. Multiple thin coats of finish, properly cured between applications, create a film that is dramatically more durable and more beautiful than one thick coat. When I switched to applying 4 or 5 thin coats of wiping varnish with light sanding between each one, the depth and durability of my finishes improved more than I expected. Number 9. Building without understanding seasonal change. This ties back to wood movement, but it goes further. Japanese craftsmen think about what season it is when they are cutting their joints. If you cut a tight-fitting joint in the summer when wood is at its widest, that joint will be loose in the winter when the wood contracts. They time their joinery to account for this. A joint cut in winter will tighten in summer. That is a level of planning most of us have never even considered, and it is one of the reasons their work lasts centuries. Number 10. Treating furniture like an assembly project instead of a craft. This is the one that changed my thinking the most. Modern woodworking culture, especially online, has turned furniture building into an assembly process. Buy pre-dimensioned lumber, cut parts to a cut list, screw it together, finish it in a weekend. Japanese masters treat every piece as a relationship between the craftsman and the wood. They study the board. They plan the grain orientation for beauty and strength. They consider how the piece will age over 50 years. That mindset is the real difference. It is not about spending more money or more time. It is about paying attention. Now for that bonus tip I promised you at the beginning. This one comes from watching a Japanese timber framer lay out a complex joint, and it was so simple I could not believe I had never seen it before. When marking out a mortise, instead of measuring from the edge of the board with a tape measure, he used a single marking gauge set to the mortise width. He scribed from both faces of the board toward the center. Where the 2 lines met, that was his mortise, perfectly centered, regardless of whether the board was exactly the thickness he expected. No math, no measuring, just 2 scribe lines from opposite faces. I have been doing this for about 3 years now, and my mortises are centered perfectly every single time. It takes about 10 seconds, and it eliminates an entire category of error. Try it on your next project. You will not go back. One more thing before I let you go. I spent a long time gathering the best ancient Eastern woodworking methods I have come across, and I put them all into a book called Kenji's Workshop. 100 techniques that most modern woodworkers have never seen, with step-by-step photos and clear explanations you can actually follow in your shop. Scan the QR code on screen right now, or grab it from the first link in the description. I appreciate you watching, and I will see you in the next one.